Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
People in Common hit their 50th birthday this year. And so the Diggers and Dreamers podcast is offering up a 2-part interview with Barbara Sanders and Chris Coates. In this first half, Barbara recounts the very first meeting of what would become People in Common and their move from squatting to communal home ownership. Chris, who joined People in Common in 1978, describes how this group of income-sharing individuals gradually became organised enough to buy a nearby derelict mill. But don't let me spill the story. It's much better coming from them. Our guests today are Barbara Sanders and Chris Coates, both of whom were very, very early members of something known as People in Common. So we're delighted to have you with us, and I'm wondering if you might very quickly introduce yourselves before we kind of get rolling. So starting with you, Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Coates. I'm also been one of the editors for Diggers and Dreamers over time. I lived at People in Common for 20 years when I did the count up. I wasn't one of the original members. Barbara was.
Right. Well, I'm sure we'll get to that one. But Barbara, do you want to quickly tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. I grew up in London, and I went to university in Durham. And the first job I had was with the Road Research Laboratory, doing some research into children and cycling.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For a year and a bit. So, yeah, then I left the Road Research Laboratory and went to join People in Common, or help form it.
Well, that's a really good starting point. So can I start off with you actually, Barbara? Can you tell me sort of how did that come about? So how did you come from living and working in London on this journey of People in Common?
I read an article actually about the kibbutz, which inspired me to think that communal living could be a better way of achieving socialism than the normal way that you live your life. And I very much wanted to change the world. I'd read Blueprint for Survival when I was at university. It's influenced me tremendously about the need to have some care for the planet. So when it came to leaving university, me and my current partner, who was called Derek Goffin, and his brother, we went looking for a group to join. And we discovered the magazine Undercurrents. And we found an advert for a group of people who wanted to set up a new working, living group. And we went to its first meeting in Dewsbury. Yeah. And in fact, there was a choice. There was another advert in Undercurrents that was really interesting. A group of recorder players who planned to go to Ireland, buy a field and become self-sufficient. I'm not quite sure how they plan to carry on.
Well, by playing recorders, I can only assume.
There are a lot of issues about land ownership, as I recall. Anyway, we decided that People in Common was more our cup of tea. And we went to Dewsbury and spent the weekend thrashing out some principles by which we might form a group, which included care for the planet and living near a town, but in the country, and socialist principles it was.
How many people would you say were at that initial meeting?
There were about 16, I think, 16 to 20. I can't recall really exactly. And it was an interesting group. That many of the people there have been involved in the squatting movement in London, and they were looking for a different way of, a different relationship to living in a living situation. They didn't want to be owners of housing and property, and they didn't want to be tenants, because of, if you're a tenant, you tend to have a terrible life, don't you? Landlords don't do what you want. But to own a property is quite a big investment in that you may not be ready for. It may not fit where you're working or all sorts of other things. So one of the outcomes of this initial meeting was that we wanted to change the housing association rules and set up a housing cooperative, where we could be part of the management committee, and we would be tenants, but we would have a lot of power as a tenant. So there were quite a lot of exciting things came out of that initial meeting.
Were there any examples? That's quite in itself quite a radical thing to kind of go, okay, we're going to reset our relationship with our housing and our, were you thinking of other projects, or were you drawing from ideas that you had around you at the time?
I think the desire to have a different relationship, the desire to set up a housing co-op was ours, really. We could see housing associations didn't provide accommodation. They were like landlords, and obviously there's private landlords. But there were housing association rules that we'd looked at. And one of our number, Trevor Howell, he was a solicitor, and he was in a position to be able to work on those rules and radically slim them down and create a new model for housing co-ops, which is what probably took us a couple of years, but that's what we set about doing.
Fantastic. And did you know where you were going to be located, or was that also part of the process and the discussion?
We'd heard lots of tales about cheap housing in the north, anywhere where the Industrial Revolution had moved on. So like around Burnley, you've got lots of mills that were derelict. And in other places, there were mining villages that were derelict and so on. And one of the decisions we took was everybody to go looking around the country for some likely place that might, be what we needed. So we weren't that fixed. I suppose in many ways we wanted one big property, but that didn't stop us when we found Burnley that had loads of 2 up, 2 down, very, very cheap housing. It didn't stop us. We said, we can afford this.
So like the where you ended up is they were like terraces, weren't they? So lots of houses quite close together. It's quite incredible to think that you said we all just went off and had a look. This is pre-internet. This would have been,
yes,
I'm assuming, literally walking up and down streets, going, that's empty, that's empty. That's a possibility. Is that me imagining?
I think people did different things. Some people did road trips in a car, and other people hitched around. Just
the founding mythology is that a guy called Daniel Wimberley was hitching, and his lift just happened to be going to Burnley, and he couldn't believe how cheap the housing was.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking 1973, 74, but I mean, and the story I remember from Daniel was that he saw a house, I think it was £1,500 it was on offer.
Wow.
And the assumption was that there must be something wrong with it, and that we would need to get a survey. Well, the group, but this is pre-May joining, that there would need to be a survey done on it. So they paid an engineer to do a survey, who said, no, there's nothing wrong with the house, but you're being overcharged because you're from out of town and you don't know what the prices are.
The first, we used to have every time we had a meeting of the group that was set up, we'd put in 50 pence each to build up our coffers in 1973. And by the time we were thinking about by the time we decided that Burnley had enough properties, cheap properties, to make it a going concern, so to speak, the idea was that we'd get into the area and then we'd have a different sort of look for the sort of property we were really hoping to get, because we wanted a bit of land as well. And the first property, it had a compulsory purchase. It had been compulsory purchase, but it was sitting there waiting, boarded up, waiting for lots of other properties to be also ready to be demolished. And we put in an offer of £50 and we bought it off the council. And because we'd got quite a few people from the squatting movement, they were very au fait with how you get water on and putting up a little windmill in the backyard to get a tiny light in the outside toilet and, things like that. So at 50 quid, you couldn't believe it, really.
That's pretty amazing. This sounds quite familiar to something we had in a previous podcast. So compulsory purchases are quite often when councils or local authorities want to get rid of something, and there was this sort of thing where you could buy it on the basis that you might not permanently.
Yes.
It might not be permanent. Is that sort of the base? Yeah.
But when in the time came to that they needed it and so on, we had to leave it, or we probably didn't really want to live in it any longer with its one little light like a torch in the toilet. We sold it back to the council for £62. It was quite good, made a profit. But the houses they gradually went up in price, but the next house we bought was something like 200 quid, and I don't think we paid more than 1,000 for any of the houses in Burnley Wood in that sort of 5-year period that we.
I mean, it is worth remembering, I suppose, that the national average salary was probably quite a bit lower in those days as well. It's like it's.
Oh yes,
yeah.
But, I mean, to bear in mind, when I moved, I was living near Reading for my job, and we'd gone to look at a house to buy in Reading before we decided to move up to Burnley. And it was a very tiny house, and it was £7,000. So that's your comparison, 7,000 versus a couple of hundred.
Wonderful. And did you have the name People in Common at that stage, or was that something else that came later?
Oh no, I think that came out of the first meeting.
Oh, okay. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we had a lot of names would have been in the hat, but I don't think we were ever that. Some names are really fantastic, aren't they? They just feel right. But that's what People in Common. It was a bit of a description. Fine. I mean, the other thing is that we wanted the sort of model we were looking to set up was something that was reproducible, something that other people could do, which, because we were buying things that were so cheap, that was quite a consideration.
So you moved up to Burnley, picked something, by the sound of it, that was very affordable in order to sort of create a base or something to work from, as it were, and get to know the area and kind of expand from that. How many of you moved into that very first house?
Well, the first house was only big enough for about 4 people, which is why we kept buying houses. as more people moved up. And I suppose at the biggest point, how many houses would it have been? 6 or something. 2 on Kirkgate, Clarence.
I think it's when I joined, there were 7 houses, and in the end we had 9 in Burnley Wood.
9 houses. So they weren't all attached to each other. They weren't all attached to each other.
No. 2 sets of them were attached, so there were 2 together. Then we could knock through. They were tiny, and they all needed renovation. And because they all needed renovation, we had to, although we'd got these fantastic squatters who could turn the water on and so on, but we needed to learn lots of proper skills, plumbing, electricity, plastering, joinery, so that we could actually do them up. And that was pretty valuable, really, for what was to come. Yeah.
How did you learn those skills?
Well, some people went on training courses. There were TOPS courses. Is that what they were called? TOPS courses?
What's the TOPS course?
It will be an acronym for something. I can't remember what it stood for.
It was, but it was like you'd go for 6 months, something like that, to a training course in the building trades. So there were. Peter did a TOPS course in joinery, and Laura, his partner, did a TOPS course in plastering. And we'd got somebody who knew how to do electrics as part of the group at that point, and we'd got a painter decorator. So we'd got quite a few skills there, and the rest we learnt out of a book.
Like a sort of DIY for squatters and house renovators. That's just fantastic.
Well, yeah, and then each of the people that were skilled taught somebody else. Everyone had an apprentice. Yeah, so that's how I came to be an apprentice plasterer.
And for the 1970s, quite progressive, because I've seen photographs because Chris's book, People in Common, has got some images from some of the early days, and there are photographs of women plastering, building, doing some really quite what would have been at the time stereotypically male jobs. Did you feel that you were sort of breaking some of the social boundaries at the time?
Definitely. We joined Women in Manual Trades and things like that. Yeah, got a fair amount of involvement and finding other women who were interested in building work. Yeah.
Yeah, when I joined in 1978, hadn't you just finished a job creation program, a sort of organised scheme?
We started the job creations to set up Orphan Workers Co-op as a building co-op. That's right.
Yeah, there was a period doing up Clarence Street with Woody and Co, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And that morphed into the building co-op. Yes, that was the period when I joined. I mean, I came through the same sort of trajectory. I'd been a squatter in London. I left school, wanted to work in the theatre, and sort of ended up living in squats in London. And then one of the other people who I'd lived with said, "Oh, you should go and see People in Common. You'll like them." That was it. I was going, what shall I do? I quite like this living with other people in big squats. It was, yeah. And so I rode my motorbike up all the way up north, and yeah, there was this group of people, and it felt a bit like owning your own squat. Yeah. It was so familiar, and okay, you had to do it up. You were living in cheap, poor quality housing that needed renovating. Yeah, it just felt so familiar to me.
I've had a fantastic note here from our I don't know what to call him, our editor, to say apparently that the TOPS were the were actually a scheme that ran from 1972. And not only was it about giving people proper skills, but there was also an allowance attached to it of £22 a week. So how fantastic is that? To be able to learn the skills and kind of draw down a little bit of support from that.
Chunk of history there.
Wonderful.
Because, well, after we'd set up the housing court rules, model rules, is it Lynch and Co. in or Wrigley's? Was it Wrigley's?
Malcolm Lynch.
Malcolm Lynch from Wrigley's Solicitors. He took our rules and he morphed them into a set of building court rules.
Or worker co-op rules for ICOM, the Industrial Common Ownership Movement.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So there's loads of things going on here at the same time.
Absolutely. So when we wanted to set up a building co-op to start using the skills that we'd developed to earn money, then we were able to go back to those new worker co-op rules and use them for our Autumn Workers Co-op.
It's interesting, Chris, that you say about it feeling a bit like a squat you owned. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
I don't know. I mean, you could get an improvement grant from the council, so you got some help to do it up. It was, I mean, in that case, it wasn't like squatting. You had no threat of somebody evicting you, coming round and just kicking you out. But I don't know what I really mean is partly it was the camaraderie that you got from squatting. You were all in the same boat. Partly squatting had that radical edge of reclaiming housing, and it was a bit pie in the sky if you were squatting that you were really doing anything radical except housing yourselves, because you couldn't afford anything else. But at People in Common, it felt like, no, here is a radical way of reconfiguring that relationship with property. And it's one of my great regrets is I never met Trevor Howell, who did all the work on what became the model rules for housing co-ops, because he died a year before I joined. So he was one of the sort of driving forces in setting up People in Common. And 3 or 4 years in, he died tragically in a motorcycle accident. And I think that coming in, that felt like it had been a real sort of test of the group, that the group might have collapsed, having a sort of key member die, and then another member, Ray, die quite soon afterwards. It felt like the group was going sort of into a different phase when we were setting up the building co-op. More organised, not, dare I say it, a bit less hippie-ish, bit less sort of, not that we ever shook off that. We desperately tried all the years we were there never to use the word commune. We could come up with
all of you lot all living together in shared houses across the street.
Yeah.
Not a commune.
Yeah.
I know.
So Barbara, do you remember that transition of sort of becoming more organised and kind of moving into becoming a cooperative as opposed to sort of, something less structured?
Definitely. I think a lot of things stemmed from the housing, because when we started to do up the houses, some people would be working on those houses and therefore they couldn't go and get a job outside. Other people who didn't have those skills or didn't want to be involved in that might be working outside of the group and bringing money in. So there was an issue about how we were going to, at that point, to start with, everyone had their own, everyone always had their own income, albeit, signing on the dole or bringing in an income. So when we decided we were going to support some members to do the building work, then that was when we set up income pooling. which is a key transitional thing, so that we could pay Lex to be a painter decorator,
So how did that work, Barbara? Was it everybody was income pooling across all 9 houses because you were one kind of entity? And how did it work, in reality?
It was quite interesting, really. It worked much better. The poorer we were, the better it worked, for sure. And I think one of the key things I took from it was that the people who were putting money into the pot were all very happy. The people who were having to take money out of the pot felt uncomfortable with it. There was for some people, there was patriarchal issues. I'm the breadwinner. I want the money for all of my family, and I'll look after it, sort of thing. So there were lots of challenges that came up from doing it, but it was quite good. And then it also meant, because we were income pooling, that we stopped thinking that this job is more important than another job, sort of thing. I remember sitting and sweeping the floor on a building site, and we were paid £2 an hour in those days, theoretically. And I was paid £2 an hour, just like the joiner was, So it changed your value that you put to the work.
So it's a flat rate. Nobody was valued any more than anyone else, regardless of what you did. It was a £2 rate.
Yeah.
Chris,
1977 or something, yeah. But it was very low. It was very low.
do you have memories of income pooling? Were you part of that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it lasted for the best part of 20 years, the income pool.
Yeah.
And it became something you didn't really think about. I mean, occasionally we had to talk about it, whether we had enough money, how much could we afford. We all got a personal allowance each week, which some of us tried to tie to the price of beer, so that you could always get the same number of pints for your personal allowance each week.
Right.
We failed. I remember we failed to tie your personal allowance to the price of beer. But and I mean, it worked so well that, I mean, for 10 years, I didn't have a personal bank account because I didn't need one.
Because all your needs were met.
All my needs were met. I got a cash allowance. If I needed to write a check, there was a group bank account, and that could write a check for me. And when I actually in the end went and tried to get a bank account, it was really difficult because they were going, "How have you survived?" I mean, the people in the bank couldn't understand how you could survive without having a bank account.
The other interesting thing about income pooling, when I was the treasurer for a bit, is that we would budget. We'd have all these pots of money. This is for the electric bills, this is for the ground rent or whatever. And when we needed to do an investment in order to set up the building co-op, for instance, we'd got a pool of money. And as long as we had confidence that we were going to earn some money, you could invest in something. So, for instance, we could invest in a delivery van and do small deliveries because the income was coming back in. Now, it was a certain amount of risk involved in that, but one that we could collectively do. And I suppose it really demonstrated to me the power of working together, really. One of us on their own couldn't have raised the money for a van, but sort of 12 people collectively pooling the surpluses, could do it.
That's really powerful. That's really, this idea that you're not just collectivizing your living, you're also sort of spreading the risk.
Yes.
But also So enabling you to do things that you couldn't do as individual or even as single families.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite clear that it mitigated the risks you had if you were on benefits, that your check didn't arrive, or I mean, it just evened out all that sort of pressure that you have when you're on low income. I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but we were poor. We didn't have very much money. I mean, it didn't feel like it at the time, but I look back and go, we really didn't have much money. But compared to other people who were on the same level of income, we had resources that they couldn't have. I mean, I went round, you go round to friends' houses and they would have no toys for their children. I mean, we all
We had discussions about whether children should have toys, as I recall.
but yeah, there were interesting discussions.
Yeah, I'm sure there would have been some contentious around that. So how did you decide who lived where? So if you had these little houses rather than these big sprawling kind of big house communes, which people quite often kind of visualize when they're thinking about communities, how did you allocate space? How did you choose who lived where? How, did you have, yeah.
It was more a case of somebody was coming and which house had a spare room, I think, for a lot of that. I don't think we...
And could people move? Could people...
Oh, yeah.
Go, I'd like to go down to number 12 because there's someone there I'd like to spend a bit more time with, or,
It didn't used to work like that so much, I don't think, but it was more... You'd have... When we'd done up a house, we would know who was the next person who needed to move into it, possibly to liberate a house that needed to be done up,
And we sort of had one central house that was, if you like, the communal house.
Yeah, we did, yes.
Where we would have communal meals. Yeah. The interesting thing to me now, living in a co-housing project, is how flexible living in little terraced houses all around the corner from each other was. Yeah. You could choose to be a bit private if you wanted to be. There was the space to do that, or you could be in the central communal sort of hub, yeah. And when we moved to the mill eventually to being in one single building, we lost a bit of that flexibility.
And what about your neighbours? What about people who perhaps were squeezed between two of these houses that were, quote, not communes? How are they getting on?
They were often pretty supportive. One neighbour did once arrive back with a small child wrapped in a towel sort of thing, because she obviously didn't think that they should be out on the street naked.
So one of your children, not your one of the children,
yes,
running around naked, gets returned in a towel.
I remember
they're only just down the road. There was no distance.
I mean, I remember one of the neighbours saying, when you put the advert in the window, advertising that you were running a building firm, everything made sense. That was why your front room looked like a creche, and you obviously had an office and things. You were obviously not a bunch of dirty hippie scroungers anymore. And I went, okay, maybe it's what you project that people look at you. And so I mean, we had a good reputation as a building co-op.
You've mentioned the mill, Chris, and obviously we're creeping our way slowly towards that. Was it always the intention that that you were going to buy something bigger and collective? Was there a long-term plan, or was it much more organic than that?
You want me to? I don't know. I wasn't there. It had just been bought when I joined.
All right, 1977. It was a long-term plan. We wanted... The idea is that we would live together under one roof in a bigger property, but it was always difficult to just find that sort of thing without being local to where things were.
So you were always kind of going, this is what we are right now. We're this collection of people in these small terraced houses.
Yeah.
But actually what we're really looking for is a single place where we can all live together.
That's right. And although we'd managed to get an allotment, so we did have a little bit of land, but it was up the hill, and the thing I remember most was that you'd go up there to feed the chickens and find that there were less each day, because somebody else was getting there first. That didn't feel very secure and safe. But so it was always the idea to get a bigger property with a bit of land so that we could grow food and so on.
And do you remember?
Have workshops, for employment. People could have their own workshops, doing whatever they want, doing what they wanted to do. So we were always on the lookout, and we'd wander around in the building van and look at interesting places like Exwhistle Hall.
Exwhistle Hall.
We went and had a look at Exwhistle Hall. It's still there, falling down. It's a Grade 1 listed building, and we looked at it and we thought, oh, it looks lovely, doesn't it? But probably couldn't afford to buy it. And
so, do you remember, Barbara, seeing? I'm calling it the mill, but I'm sure it had a name. Do you remember seeing it the first time?
Oh yeah. It was. It's a very lovely little building. It's got a small chimney. It's got a listed chimney actually, so that had its own issues because it did have a listed chimney, and it's sort of nestled down by the river, and it was very nice.
Was it a cotton mill?
It was a water mill.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't it?
Was it been used for various things? It did have a short history in the textile industry, but I think its last use as a mill was making parts for other mills, so as a joinery workshop. But actually, the last use before people in common bought it was as a giant chicken shed. There was 3 inches of chicken shit on the floor.
Attractive.
Yeah, and the guy who was the neighbour opposite he'd been running sheep on the field, and there was a 3-acre field with the building. So it was a 3.5 stories stone built building, fairly early industrial, early 1800s. But there'd been a mill of some sort there previous to that. And I remember showing my mum and dad round, and they were absolutely horrified. They said they didn't say anything at the time because they didn't want to dishearten me, but they looked at this derelict building. It was derelict, and thought, how on earth are these people going to do this building up? They've hardly got any money. About 3 of them have got some basic DIY and building skills, but they're not proper builders. They're not a proper building firm. How on earth is it going to happen?
You can imagine the car drive home, Chris, with your mum and dad.
Yeah.
I don't know your parents' names. Jeffrey, it's never going to happen.
Am and Harold. Yes, they would have had that conversation. What on earth has he got himself into?
It's interesting. I think that the area was there was quite a lot of stuff owned. It was like an estate that was being broken up. And it was for sale at £10,000. And we didn't have £10,000. In fact, I think we might have only had about £1,000. And we did a whip round of people's parents to see what, how much we could raise on various loans. And people's friends and relatives and other groups even, I think, chipped in. And we've got up to 7,000. And so we put in a bid for 7,000.
Cash
And
offer.
after a year, they sold it to us for 7,000.
So you put in an offer for 7, which they turned down because it was below
Well,
the
yes,
offer, and you waited them out
Well,
basically.
we might have offered something even less to start with. I can't really remember the actual.
for your derelict,
But we got
chicken infested
Yeah.
mill. I mean, you said, Barbara, at one point, and it was just a little mill, but I think a 3-story mill, that's one heck of an undertaking.
Definitely. It was an interesting building because it had a sort of a rectangular side and it had a square side, and they were, broadly speaking, they were of similar area, but in a different layout. And then there was the boiler house, and the boiler house still had the boiler in it being connected to this chimney.
Yeah, and when we started off, I've referred to Woody before. Woody was someone from Leicester who thought, I think he once said, People in Common was the least worst commune he'd ever seen, and that was damned us with faint praise. But he thought we were good, but we were the least worst. But he said, "Oh God, no! You shouldn't have touched the mill. It's going to take you at least 10 years before you'll get there." And we went, "No, it won't." Yeah. So we bought it in 1977 and we moved in 1989. And so it took us best part of 10 years because we had no money.
And we'd only done up half of it, hadn't we?
Yeah. Yeah, when we moved in, we'd only done up half of it.
And I think that's probably a fantastic point to just say, I think this is going to be part 2, and we're going to be invite you back.
There are, probably we don't want to go into what happened. I would like to go back and just make a comment about what Barbara said about being reproducible, because it's something we sort of forgot about. And when we were living there, we didn't feel we really did anything about it. We did send out 3 copies of the model rules that Trevor Howell had drawn up to anybody who sent us a stamped addressed envelope. What we'd had to do in the days before email. And I think that had the sort of ripple effect, the stone in the pond ripple effect, because it was picked up by the National Federation of Housing Co-ops. They developed it into their model rules. Catalyst Co-op and Radical Roots used those model rules. As Barbara said previously, Wrigley's solicitors, Malcolm Lynch, who's at Wrigley's now, developed them for workers' co-op rules. And that is the bit, when I look back, that really made it reproducible. Okay, they weren't doing people in common in these other places. They were doing their own thing, but it enabled them. That sort of fully mutual housing co-op rules is the sort of foundation of that whole housing co-op movement and worker co-op movement. And the fact that it came out of some sort of cheap terraced housing in Burnley is just, when I look back, it's one of the great achievements of people in common. I mean, the other achievement is the mill, and if we come back into part 2, it's a story worth telling.
Well, I was about to say, thank you so much, both of you. It would be really good if we could record part 2, and then we can put the 2 together and people can listen to them in order, out of order, whatever works for them. It's also, just as a very quick note for those people who are listening to this, that this People in Common still exists. It's still there, and they will shortly be celebrating their 50th anniversary. So please join us next time. Thank you both. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communade's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.